The ground was soaked with blood and rain as the last echoes of gunfire faded into the darkness. Smoke hung in the air, thick and suffocating, clinging to his lungs with every shallow breath. He lay motionless among the bodies, his uniform torn, the side of his face pressed into cold mud. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, louder than the thunder that rolled above. For a moment, time fractured. He couldn't tell if minutes or hours had passed. The pain in his leg was a distant throb now, almost muted by the weight of exhaustion. The radio on his chest crackled with static, then silence. There was no backup coming. There was no one left to call. Somewhere out in the darkness, footsteps shifted across wet gravel. They were searching. Slow, careful, deliberate. He could hear them whispering in a language he didn't understand. Each step drew closer, then paused, as if sniffing out the living among the dead. He didn't move. He couldn't. Breathing had become a calculation. Too loud, and they'd find him. Too shallow, and he might pass out. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the distant sound of a helicopter passed and faded. Too far to matter now. His mind began to wander. To the last thing he said to his daughter before deployment. The unopened letter in his chest pocket. The promise he made to his best friend, now lying cold beside him. He blinked against the stinging rain, forcing himself to stay alert. The footsteps were closer now. 30 feet. 20. A flashlight beam sliced through the dark, flicking over twisted limbs and burnt gear. The beam passed over him once, then returned. He held his breath. His left hand, buried beneath him, curled slowly around a jagged piece of metal. He didn't know if he'd survive the next 60 seconds, but he knew what had to happen if he wanted a chance. One chance. No mistakes. No sound. No mercy. He waited in the silence long after the footsteps had faded, his body locked in place, muscles trembling with the tension of stillness. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, tapping against his helmet in a cruel, rhythmic reminder that time was still moving even if he wasn't. Slowly, he uncoiled from the mud, inch by inch, until he could lift his head enough to see past the ridge. The terrain was unfamiliar. He'd studied satellite maps before the mission, but nothing had prepared him for how different it all looked from the ground in the aftermath of chaos. What was supposed to be a coordinated assault had turned into a massacre within the first 20 minutes. The ambush had been surgical, ruthless. They came not from the hills like expected, but from beneath, through dry irrigation canals that hadn't shown up on recon. By the time the first shots rang out, it was too late. Communications jammed, the convoy scattered, and now, the others were either dead or too far to matter. He had no idea where command was, if the fallback point still existed, or if this part of the valley had already been overrun. The valley below offered no cover, just broken rock, burned-out vehicles, and the faint flicker of what used to be the forward observation post. Smoke curled from its remains, black and oily against the pale sky. Somewhere out there were the enemy fighters. He couldn't tell how many, couldn't trust his own senses anymore. It felt like they were everywhere. The silence wasn't comforting, it was calculating, like the pause before a storm. He scanned the surroundings, measuring distances between cover points, mentally tracing a path, though he knew none of them offered real safety. Every option led back to the same conclusion. He couldn't go back the way he came. The route was compromised, the terrain too open, and he was running low on everything. His canteen was nearly empty. 2 magazines left, one half spent, and his leg injury, while not crippling, slowed him just enough to guarantee he'd be caught in any open sprint. Every instinct screamed to move, to escape, to run toward the next ridge or hiding spot, but his training kept him grounded. Movement without information was suicide. He needed to know what was out there. Patience was no longer a virtue. It was a requirement. But the longer he stayed in place, the greater the chance they'd sweep back through. He had to find a position with better elevation, something that would give him an advantage, or at least a choice. Right now, all he had were threats and dead ends. The canal that had betrayed them in the beginning was now his only plausible route forward. It curved sharply west, snaking through brush and shallow craters. If he could get into it without being seen, he might have a chance to reposition, but he'd be crawling. Completely exposed from above, with no guarantee of what waited around the bend. He pulled himself up to his knees, every joint stiff with cold and adrenaline fatigue. The weight of his gear seemed doubled now, every movement echoing louder in his head than it did in the world around him. He checked his weapon, adjusted the sling, and pulled the radio from his vest again. Still nothing. Static hissed back at him like white noise from a distant dream. He tucked it away and began to crawl. Each foot of progress felt earned with pain. The mud clung to him, greedy and thick. Twigs snapped under his weight. His leg burned. Not far now. The edge of the canal came into view, closer than he expected, but deeper too. He hesitated at the lip, listening. Nothing. He rolled over and dropped in, landing hard on one side, knocking the wind from his lungs. Still, no response from the landscape around him. No shouts, no bullets, no sudden flash of movement. Just the sound of his own breath and the drip of water down the canal wall. The trench was narrower than he thought, barely wide enough to crouch. Branches hung low overhead, casting jagged shadows that made it hard to tell what was natural and what wasn't. He moved slowly, checking every bend before advancing, mindful of booby traps, pressure wires, the things insurgents left behind for exactly this kind of desperation. Every step forward was a gamble. The air grew colder the deeper he went, damp earth rising around him like a tunnel to nowhere. And then the smell hit him. Burned oil, blood, and something else. Old death. He wasn't the first to crawl this route. That meant someone had either tried to escape or been dragged. Neither option inspired hope. He pressed forward, counting his steps, keeping his weight low, rifle raised just enough to clear the edge if needed. Time lost meaning. 10 minutes? 30? He couldn't tell anymore. The only goal was distance. The only mission now was survival. Suddenly, the trench widened. A collapsed section had formed a kind of pocket, a place to rest, or a trap. He froze and waited, eyes scanning the edges for movement. Nothing. No fresh prints. He stepped in, knees trembling, and let himself breathe for a moment. His arms ached from crawling, his leg throbbed with every heartbeat, but he was alive. For now. He leaned against the wall and listened. Somewhere above, the crack of branches told him he wasn't alone anymore. They were near, hunting. And now he was boxed in again. The only path forward was deeper into the canal, or back the way he came, and going back was no longer an option. He knew too much now. They'd seen too much. Whatever came next, he'd have to face it head-on. The walls around him closed in tighter, the light above dimming as the sun dipped lower behind the ridge. The darkness would soon belong to him or to them. A sudden rustle cut through the stillness like a blade. He dropped instinctively, pressing his body into the wall of the canal, weapon angled upward, breath frozen in his throat. The sound wasn't close, but it wasn't distant either. Just above the lip of the trench, movement shimmered between the trees, barely visible but unmistakable. A figure shifted behind a boulder, rifle slung low, posture relaxed, unaware of the eyes watching from below. Then another, moving with caution but not stealth, scanning the terrain with the practiced rhythm of someone who had done this before. He counted 3 at first, then 4, and possibly a 5th trailing farther back, their silhouettes broken by the underbrush. They were fanned out, sweeping the ridge in slow, deliberate arcs. A patrol, or maybe a cleanup crew. Either way, it meant one thing. His presence hadn't gone unnoticed. He stayed motionless, listening to the rhythm of their boots on loose gravel. Every few steps, they paused to listen. He knew their routine because it mirrored his own from countless operations. Stop, scan, listen, advance. They were disciplined, trained. Not a roaming band of amateurs. That made them more dangerous. He stayed below the surface, a shadow beneath the earth, waiting for them to pass. For a moment it seemed like they might. The lead scout moved past his position, oblivious, stepping lightly across the collapsed section of the trench. 1 more minute, he thought. Just 1 more, and they'd be gone. But then the 5th man hesitated. Something caught his attention. Maybe the faint shift in scent, or the uneven ground, or a glint of metal buried in the mud. He turned and approached the canal's edge. Time fractured. The barrel of his rifle lifted by reflex. The man above looked down, their eyes met, and instinct overrode thought. One shot cracked through the air, too loud, too close, shattering the quiet like glass. The figure above dropped immediately, dead before his body hit the slope. Shouts erupted. The others fanned out. Another burst of automatic fire sliced overhead, chipping stone, splintering bark. He rolled into cover, heart hammering against his ribs, adrenaline flooding every limb. His legs screamed in protest as he scrambled to find a better angle, but there was no time to check it. The canal had turned from shelter to snare. He was boxed in, fire raining down from above. Dirt exploded around him. Bullets tore through branches. He fired 3 shots blind, just enough to slow their advance, then slid backward down the trench as fast as his body would allow. He reached the next bend just as another volley zipped past his shoulder. He ducked behind a collapsed wall of roots, the only cover in sight, and assessed his magazine. Half gone. The noise was deafening now, the air heavy with gunpowder and mud. He could hear one of them closing in from the east, fast, aggressive, the kind of rush that demanded immediate response. He steadied his breath and waited. The man appeared at the edge, rifle up, scanning low. A single clean shot sent him backward, body crumpling into the trench. No time to feel anything, no time to think. The remaining fighters shifted tactics, pulling back and circling the canal. They were going to try and flush him out. He needed to move. He sprinted to the next curve, low and silent. Another crack of gunfire sounded from behind, a miss, but close. He reached a small outcropping, dropped to his knees, and turned just in time to see one of his own fall. It wasn't a stranger. It was Carter, the radio operator. Young, stubborn, always the last to retreat. Somehow, impossibly, he'd caught up. Maybe he'd been tracking from another flank. Maybe he was just trying to help. It didn't matter. The round had caught him in the chest, folding him in on himself like a dying flame. For a moment, Carter's eyes locked with his, wide with pain, surprise, and a silent understanding that this was it. He tried to reach forward, but the movement failed halfway. Blood bubbled from his lips. The body slumped against the canal wall, rifle clattering uselessly to the ground. The loss hit harder than the gunfire. It wasn't just the death. It was the suddenness of it. The cruelty of hope offered and ripped away in the same breath. There was no time for grief, but it dug its claws deep anyway. He grabbed Carter's sidearm, pocketed 2 extra mags, and forced himself to crawl over the body, pushing forward because there was no other option. The trench curved again, leading toward a rocky incline that offered some elevation. He climbed, slipping twice, mud coating his gloves, bullets still snapping somewhere behind. He reached the crest just as the forest opened into a clearing. Smoke from earlier fires drifted across the open space, distorting shapes and shadows. His mind raced. The firefight had lasted less than 5 minutes, but felt like hours. He had no idea if he was being pursued, if more were on the way, or if he'd just punched a hole through the edge of something larger. What he did know was that he was now truly alone. The others were gone. Carter was dead. The trench route was compromised. And somewhere behind him, there were at least 2 fighters still unaccounted for, likely regrouping. He crouched low, listening, scanning, trying to recapture the clarity that had carried him this far. His muscles ached, his legs screamed. The rifle in his hand felt heavier with every second. But he was alive. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. He moved forward with the numb momentum of someone whose body had outpaced the mind. The clearing offered no shelter, only a deceptive stillness that made each breath feel like a risk. His boots pressed deep into the wet ground, the earth sucking at his steps as if trying to hold him back. The weight of Carter's death lingered behind his eyes, sharp and unrelenting. Every detail had seared itself into memory. The angle of the fall, the sudden stop of motion, the silence that followed. It was not the kind of silence that offered peace. It was the kind that rang in the ears and sat heavy in the chest, pressing against the ribs until breathing became an act of defiance. He didn't want to carry that silence, but there was no one left to share it. The path ahead climbed gently toward a line of blackened trees, their trunks split and hollowed from earlier shelling. Shards of bark and twisted metal littered the ground, like remnants of a forgotten ritual. He passed the remains of what had once been a forward lookout post, now just a collapsed heap of sandbags and warped scaffolding. Blood had stained the sand long ago, now dried to a dull rust that flaked beneath his fingers when he brushed the edge. He crouched there, no longer with tactical intent, but simply because his legs refused to carry him farther without rest. The pain in his thigh had intensified, a deep thudding pulse that radiated upward, dulling thought and tightening his vision at the edges. He pulled back his pant leg. The wound had reopened, crusted blood giving way to fresh lines of red that ran in slow rivulets down to his boot. It wasn't fatal. Yet. But if infection set in, or if he lost too much more blood, it would be. The realization settled over him like frost. He wasn't just injured. He was alone. Isolated. Cut off from any command, without map, backup, or extraction. The valley stretched around him like a basin of forgotten violence. He could still hear distant echoes, random cracks of gunfire, short bursts of automatic weapons that came and went with the wind. None of it concerned him now. Not because it wasn't dangerous, but because it no longer felt real. His body had become a tool. Move, breathe, shoot, move again. His mind, though, hovered above him like an observer, detached and analytical, cataloging failures, questioning every decision that led to this moment. What if he had insisted on a different route during insertion? What if he had called for air support 5 minutes earlier? What if he had never signed up in the first place? He leaned back against a scorched tree, the bark tearing at his gear, and closed his eyes. Not to sleep, but to make the world go away for a few seconds. His chest ached with fatigue. His hands trembled from adrenaline withdrawal. He hadn't eaten in over 12 hours. Water was nearly gone. The thought of taking another step, of lifting the rifle, of reacting to one more threat was unbearable. His fingers brushed over the radio again, more from ritual than hope. Static. Always static. He considered switching it off to conserve the battery, but then again, what difference would it make? No one was listening. No one was coming. The hopelessness crept in slowly, like a tide he hadn't noticed rising until it was around his neck. He tried to push it back with reason, with training, but none of that helped now. None of that brought Carter back. None of it erased the sounds or smells or the look on his friend's face. He thought of home, but the images were warped, distant, like looking through water. He couldn't remember the last conversation he'd had with anyone outside of his unit. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt something other than alertness or exhaustion. Emotions had become luxuries. But now, with the mission dead, the unit gone, and his body failing, there was space for them to return, and they came in waves. Regret was first, sharp and fast, followed by guilt so deep it felt like drowning. He saw faces, his team, civilians from other deployments, people he couldn't name but whose eyes stared back in judgment. The war had become a blur of decisions and consequences. And now, in the quiet, every one of them rose to the surface. He pressed the heel of his hand into his eyes, trying to force them back, but it was no use. They were part of him now, burned into the same memory that remembered the layout of villages, the weight of certain triggers, the taste of desert dust. He wanted to cry, but even that had been taken. He had gone too far down, pushed too far past the point where tears were possible. All he could do was sit there, blood slowly soaking through his gear, watching the tree line for movement that might not come, waiting for a sign, any sign, that he wasn't the last man alive in a place that had forgotten its name. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the faintest sound of choppers in the distance. He turned his head, straining to listen, but it faded just as quickly as it arrived. False hope. A trick of the terrain. Or maybe not. It didn't matter. He didn't move. Not because he was hidden, not because it was strategic, but because he had nothing left to give. Above him, the sky had turned the color of old steel. The sun was dipping behind the cliffs to the west, casting long, thin shadows that stretched like arms across the clearing. He watched them move, the only living things that acknowledged him now. His rifle sat across his lap, heavier than before. He stared at it for a long time as if expecting it to speak, but it didn't. It never did. The silence settled again, deeper this time, and he let it. As the shadows grew longer and the last light drained from the broken sky, something within him began to shift. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. It didn't come as a flash of courage or a resurgence of hope. It arrived slowly, like cold seeping into bone, quiet and certain. He stared ahead at nothing in particular, his eyes following the slow drift of smoke curling between the trees, the twitch of dying leaves under the wind. The ache in his limbs had become background noise, the throb in his leg a dull rhythm he had grown used to. He no longer flinched with each pulse. His body had accepted the pain as part of its function, and now his mind was following suit. The paralysis of despair had begun to recede, not replaced by optimism, but by something sharper. Resolve. Not because he believed in survival, but because he refused to let this place be the end of his story. He shifted his weight forward and forced himself to stand, using the trunk of the scorched tree to brace against. His balance wavered, but he did not fall. That small victory mattered. The ground beneath him felt more real now. The sounds of the forest, the rustling of unseen life, the distant crackle of fires still burning, all of it formed a kind of map in his senses. His world was reduced to what he could feel, hear, and control. And in that reduction came clarity. There would be no rescue, no clean extraction. The rules were gone, command was gone. The mission had dissolved into dust and death. What was left was him, his gear, and the enemy. And that was enough. He no longer needed hope. He needed only decision. He checked his gear with methodical precision. Each motion was slow but sure. 2 magazines left, 1 half used. He distributed them evenly, reloaded with the full mag, and chambered around. He holstered the sidearm he had taken from Carter, checked the safety, then secured it tightly. His knife remained strapped to his left thigh, untouched since insertion. It felt like a relic now, but he knew its moment would come. He pulled a small vial from his vest pocket. Morphine, standard issue. Not enough to dull the pain completely, but enough to bring clarity. He injected it without hesitation, the cold burn running quick through his veins, followed by a fading of the sharpest edges of pain. His leg was still damaged, but he could move now without gasping. The haze that had clouded his vision earlier began to lift, replaced by a sharpness that bordered on detachment. His thoughts began to organize. The patrol from earlier had not swept the southern ridge, which meant that side remained an open flank. The canal had exposed him, but its western curve had led to elevation. If he circled east through the heavier brush, past the burned-out vehicles and the remnants of the command post, he could flank whatever forces remained. He estimated there were at least 3 to 5 enemy fighters still active in this sector, possibly more, depending on reinforcements. But they wouldn't expect him to engage. They believed him injured, broken, possibly dead. That assumption was his only advantage. He would make them pay for it. He started walking. Slowly at first, testing each step, adjusting for balance, measuring the weight on his bad leg. It held. He moved between trees like a wraith, silent and low, eyes scanning, ears attuned to every subtle shift in the landscape. The forest no longer felt like a trap. It felt like a tool, and he would use it. He circled wide, moving through ash and shadow, staying downwind, keeping his profile low. When he found a shallow rise with partial cover, he stopped and observed. Through the scope, he could see the edge of the last known enemy position. 2 figures stood beside a smoldering vehicle, rifles slung, their posture casual, overconfidence. A third man emerged from a collapsed shelter, speaking briefly before walking toward the others. No sign of perimeter security. No indication that they believed a threat remained. That was their mistake. He made note of angles, lines of sight, exit routes. He counted the seconds between each man's movements, mapped the path of least resistance to close the gap. His mind was quiet now, not calm, focused. Every decision served a purpose. Every action served the plan. There would be no room for hesitation. There would be no warning. He marked his path with silent points in his mind, visualizing the flow of approach, the moment of contact, the order of engagement. He checked his weapon one last time, exhaled slowly, and moved. The first 50 feet were a crawl, elbows and knees pressed into damp soil, dragging his weight through undergrowth thick with fallen branches. His breath was measured, heartbeat steady. His pulse no longer screamed in panic. It moved with purpose, in sync with his mind. When he reached the clearing's edge, he paused. 20 yards to target. The air smelled of scorched rubber and cordite. One man was seated now, cleaning a weapon. The others talked casually, unaware. He shifted his position, choosing his angle, and raised the rifle. The first shot tore through the seated man's chest before the others registered the sound. The second dropped the man turning toward the noise, hitting him center mass. The third scrambled for cover, yelling, his voice fractured by surprise. He moved quickly, changing position before returning fire. 2 more shots cracking the air and silencing the clearing. No shouting followed. No return fire. Only the long, slow drift of silence reclaiming the space where voices had just stood. He waited, eyes scanning, body frozen in position. When nothing stirred, he advanced cautiously, checking each body, retrieving ammunition, confirming kills. It was done. 3 down. No alarms raised. He had struck like a phantom, and now the enemy would think twice before assuming anything again. The action hadn't brought relief. There was no pride, no thrill, only necessity. He turned away from the bodies and moved deeper into the forest, keeping to the edge of the shadows. There were more out there. He knew that. But they weren't looking for a man who had made peace with death. They weren't ready for someone who no longer feared the outcome. He had made his decision. He wouldn't wait to be hunted. He would become the shadow that moved through the valley. And when they saw him again, it would be too late. This place would not take him without a cost. It would not take him quietly. Not now, not ever. He moved through the underbrush like a shadow loosed from form, silent, watchful, deliberate. The forest around him had begun to fade into a dull, colorless haze, the air thick with the residue of gunpowder and scorched wood. What daylight remained trickled weakly through the broken canopy, casting fractured beams onto the blood-stained dirt below. Every movement was calculated now, every breath taken with restraint. He had shifted into a new rhythm, one unburdened by fear or confusion. The valley was no longer a battlefield. It was a chessboard, and he had become the piece they had forgotten to account for. He knew how they thought, how they moved, how they assumed control through fear and numbers. That assumption would become his weapon. The enemy had grown complacent, lulled by the silence, by the lack of resistance, by the illusion of control. They believed the worst was over. He intended to use that belief to dismantle them. One by one, piece by piece. There would be no charge, no final standoff, no reckless burst of glory, just precision, calculation, punishment. They would never see him coming, and they would never understand how close he had been. He began to chart their habits, noting where sentries rotated, where they failed to overlap fields of vision, where they left gaps in patrol routes. The camp had structure, but it lacked paranoia. That flaw would cost them. He circled the outer perimeter of what appeared to be a temporary command outpost, half buried into the base of a hill, protected by makeshift barricades and shielded from aerial view by heavy tarps woven into the treetops. It had been set up fast, sloppy but functional. Guards wandered between zones with rifles slung low, inattentive, fatigued. He studied them from a concealed ridge, memorizing the shift changes, listening for cadence in their speech, identifying who gave orders and who simply followed. There was hierarchy, but no unity. Some men took orders reluctantly, others ignored them altogether. The fault lines were there. He only had to press them. As night fell, he withdrew to a dense thicket on the north side of the ridge and began gathering materials. Old shrapnel, discarded cloth, wire ripped from comm lines, glass shards from shattered optics. Everything had a use. He fashioned crude but effective noise traps, tripwires disguised in brush, snares designed not to capture but to distract and disorient. He placed them in arcs, not to wound, but to confuse. Disruption was the goal, not confrontation. The more they doubted their control, the more mistakes they would make. And in those mistakes, he would find his openings. He approached under cover of the storm that had rolled in by dusk, rain softening the ground, masking the sound of his steps. Lightning cracked far in the distance, briefly illuminating the outline of the hilltop encampment before retreating into darkness again. He slid through the trees like water, tracing the exact blind spots he had mapped earlier. At the eastern edge of the camp, a field generator emitted a low hum, its cabling running unprotected beneath the tarp line. He slit the casing with a salvaged blade, removed 3 inches of exposed copper, and rerouted the current through a thin strand of metal wire he'd embedded in the wet ground. Nothing happened immediately, but the generator began to pulse irregularly. He vanished into the brush as confused voices started to rise. He moved to the supply tent next, severing fuel lines with surgical precision, tying them off with dirtied bandages soaked in oil. As he slipped out the back, he lit a broken compass lens using a flint shard and dry powder from a field ration pouch. The flame caught slowly, then spread, eating through fabric and into the exposed fuel threads like a hungry mouth. He had already crossed to the opposite side of camp before the first explosion rocked the hillside. Screams followed, scattered and panicked, a rapid burst of disorganized shouting that echoed through the forest like a warning too late delivered. He took position near a large oak that leaned over the camp's southern slope. From there, he could see shadows scrambling in the flickering firelight, some grabbing weapons, others running blindly toward the trees. He targeted the ones giving orders, dropping 2 with clean, silent shots from a suppressed pistol looted earlier. They fell wordlessly, the confusion deepening as others took their place, unaware they were already being hunted. He didn't fire again. He didn't need to. His point had been made. The enemy was no longer chasing him. They were reacting to him. And that shift, subtle as it was, changed the entire shape of the war. As they regrouped, he moved again, returning to the ridgeline to watch from above. He allowed himself no celebration, no satisfaction. This wasn't vengeance in the name of revenge. This was control reclaimed, balance reset. They had taken from him without remorse, without thought, reducing his world to smoke and ash. But they had underestimated the strength of someone who had nothing left to lose. And now, with each disruption, each subtle manipulation of their defenses, he was turning their own weapons against them. At dawn, the camp was unrecognizable. Half of the equipment had been either destroyed or abandoned in the scramble. The chain of command had fractured. The men who remained looked over their shoulders more than they looked ahead. Paranoia had taken root. He had seen it before in enemy eyes, the twitch, the flinch, the glance into shadow where no figure stood. He had become that shadow. He had become the whisper that followed them into sleep, the creak of a branch that set off alarm, the breath of wind mistaken for movement. And he was not finished. He retreated once more to the tree line, blending back into the forest as the sun began to rise. His mind no longer entertained the idea of survival for its own sake. Survival was a means. The end was clarity. The end was control. The end was watching the enemy tear themselves apart in fear of the thing they could not see, could not touch, could not understand. That was his advantage. And he would use it, again and again, until there was no one left to doubt his presence. By the third day, the forest had grown quiet in a way that felt unnatural, as if even the wildlife had retreated, wary of the violence and fear that lingered in the soil. The fires had burned out, leaving behind blackened skeletons of tents and twisted metal. Smoke still hung low across the valley, trapped by the cold air that rolled down from the mountains. He moved carefully through the remnants of what had once been an organized outpost, now reduced to chaos and silence. There were no voices left, no radio chatter, no coordinated movements. Those who had survived had fled into the wilderness, scattered and broken. He had not needed to finish them himself. His work had made them doubt each other, second-guess every sound, every movement, every shadow. In the absence of control, they had consumed themselves. His legs were barely functional now, the wound a swollen mass wrapped in makeshift gauze, stained and stiff. He had run out of morphine the night before. The pain was constant, dull in its persistence, but manageable only because he had adapted to its presence. Hunger gnawed at his core, a slow twisting emptiness that had become part of him. He had rationed what little remained, scraps from fallen enemies, fragments of protein bars, sips of stale water gathered from leaves and mud. Every movement was a test of will over flesh. But he had made it this far, and that was enough. The decision to leave the valley came not from fear of being found, but from the realization that there was nothing left to stay for. He had completed his purpose, whatever it had been. The mission had evaporated with the first ambush, the objective lost beneath the weight of failure and blood. What he had done since was survival. Necessary, precise, brutal. But it was no longer sustainable. He could not keep moving through the trees like a ghost forever. Sooner or later, his body would collapse, and there would be no one left to see where he fell. The time had come to leave, not in retreat, but in extraction, self-declared and without ceremony. He studied the terrain from a high point near the edge of the forest, where the trees thinned and gave way to steep rock formations that led down into a lower basin. Somewhere beyond that basin was the river they had crossed days before, and beyond that, the ravine that had once marked the edge of their operational zone. He remembered the coordinates, embedded like scars in his mind. If he could reach that point, there was a chance, however slim, that he might find signal, or an automated beacon, or perhaps just the remains of equipment left behind in the chaos. It wasn't hope that guided him now. It was direction, a line to follow, no matter how broken the map had become. He descended slowly, using branches to brace his steps, sliding when balance failed. The air was colder here, thinner, edged with the scent of moss and damp stone. Each step jarred his leg, sending pulses of fire up through his thigh, but he didn't stop. The pain meant he was still alive, and that was the only currency that mattered. Hours passed, marked only by the shifting light and the distant roll of thunder that never came close. He moved in silence, speaking to no one, hearing nothing but the wind and the dull scrape of his boots over rock. By dusk, he reached the basin. The river was still there, sluggish and wide, its current broken by fallen trees and debris. He followed its edge for a while, searching for the spot they had crossed. The water was higher now, fed by recent rain, and the stones that had once formed a path were gone. He didn't hesitate. He stepped in, braced against the current, and pushed forward. The cold was immediate and vicious, clamping around his legs and chest, stealing breath with each step. He stumbled once, went under, resurfaced gasping, dragged himself forward with one arm until he collapsed on the opposite bank. He lay there for a long time, face pressed into gravel, water dripping from his gear. The sky had gone dark. Stars blinked faintly overhead, indifferent and cold. He crawled into the tree line, shivering violently, and found shelter beneath a fallen pine. The branches formed a crude canopy, just enough to break the wind. He curled into himself, muscles locking in protest, and waited for sleep that never came. Instead, his mind wandered through memories with jagged precision. Faces returned, some vivid, some warped. Carter, the others, laughter in mess tents, firelight on cold nights, orders received without question. The weight of those decisions lingered, heavier now that there was no one left to carry them. At dawn, he rose again. The final ridge stood before him, a steep climb laced with loose rock and brittle shrubs. He tackled it slowly, hands gripping roots, boots searching for purchase. His body moved without grace, every limb shaking from fatigue, but upward was the only direction. When he reached the top, the valley behind him was a smear of gray and green, silent and distant. Ahead, the ravine opened like a scar across the earth, and on the far side, a rusted relay tower leaned into the sky. It was still standing. He blinked to make sure it wasn't a trick of the light. He staggered forward, each step fueled by the thin thread of certainty that he was close. The relay tower was surrounded by scattered crates and the bones of old equipment. Forgotten, weathered, mostly dead. But the beacon was intact, solar-powered, with a backup battery. He crawled to it, fingers numb, and opened the control panel. The light was still blinking red. He flipped the switch. It blinked green. He stared at it for a long time, not knowing what to feel. Relief didn't come. Only finality. He sat beside the beacon, rifle resting across his knees, and closed his eyes. Far above, a satellite caught the signal. Somewhere, a system logged the ping. Maybe a drone would fly over in 6 hours. Maybe a rescue team would arrive in 12. Maybe nothing would happen at all. It no longer mattered. He had made it out. But the version of himself that had walked into this valley days ago had died somewhere between the first shot and the last fire. What remained was someone else. Quieter, colder, and infinitely more aware of the fragility of purpose. He didn't know what waited beyond the trees, beyond the pickup, beyond the debriefing that might never come. But he knew he would meet it differently. Because the war had ended for now. But its echo lived on in every breath he still managed to take.